Back on.
What year are you in how far along are you in your PhD?
So I'm in my 5th year of my PhD, so I'll be planning to finish and defend this summer of 2021. There. Yeah.
Okay. Are you? Right, there we go. So yes, PhD.
So I'm in
mute. All right, so we are live. So I will go ahead and welcome everybody back to our Ask a Scientist segment with the Asheville Museum of Science. My name is Abby, and today we will be talking with Imari Walker, who is almost Dr. Imari Walker. She is very close to completing her PhD. Imari does a little bit of everything. So she's an analytical chemist, probably primarily, but also an environmental engineer, oceanographer, probably a little bit of a biologist too. She's completed her master's in marine science at UC Davis, and she's now, as I said, a PhD candidate with environmental engineering department at Duke University. So her research focuses on the breakdown and the distribution of plastics in our environment. She uses some cutting edge instruments and technology to understand what the chemicals are and how they can affect everything, all the way from, microscopic marine life and all through everyday human health. And so on top of that, she is a science communicator. She's kind of an expert in that too. So she has her own YouTube channel, which I will be sharing with everybody in the comments, and I'll make a post on our Asheville Museum of Science Facebook page as well with a few resources. So if this is something that you are really interested in, or you're like, holy crap, this is scary, I got to get involved, Imari will definitely be able to have the resources to push you in that direction. So I'm going to go ahead and pass it off to her, and I hope that everybody will send in their questions, and you can take it away.
Yeah, thank you, Abby. So hi, everyone. I am probably going to do a little bit of a brief overview of microplastics before we go into some of the questions, just so that we're all on the same page. So let me do a share screen real quick, and we will go to the top. Let's talk about microplastics. Oh, wrong one. We can fix that. Okay. So today I'm going to tell you a little bit about what I do and why we should be concerned about microplastics in our environment, and even think about what implications they have for public health. So I'm going to kind of talk about what microplastics are, where we can find them, some of the hazards, particularly due to chemicals or just the size of the microplastics for terrestrial or marine organisms, and then maybe some possible avenues for concern for human health that we still need to kind of better uncover and understand. So like it was said before, I am a doctoral candidate at Duke University, and I research chemicals that are associated to microplastics, specifically microplastics located in freshwater environments mainly. And I am a microplastic science communicator, and you all will be getting the link to my YouTube channel. I also do podcast appearances, some articles, but I really do have a passion for talking about the issue of plastic pollution. So let's just get everyone on the same page. Microplastics are not great, and they are everywhere. You can see in the picture in the middle, that's what looks to be sand at the top of a bottle. It is actually microplastics. So microplastics are defined as pieces of plastic that are smaller than 5 millimeters. How small is 5 millimeters? Well, that's about the size of a push pin on a bulletin board. Anything smaller than the diameter of that is a microplastic. And they can be characterized by their shapes, if they're fragments or if they are beads, to being fibers or films. Even their size ranges change pretty drastically to the colors that you find of microplastics. And we as scientists look at them as either primary or secondary microplastics. Primary are those that are specifically made to be that small. Things like microbeads in our face wash or a body wash or industrial paints, to just breaking down larger plastics like bottled water or our clothes into fibers. So how do we make secondary microplastics? Because those are the things that we see primarily in our environment. Well, it usually is from exposure to water, wind, sunlight, or even mechanical abrasion, where you see those bottles that are left on the beach getting, beaten up by the waves and by the sand, by the heat. And you see images of that, like especially during the summer, where there's plastic that's been left out all summer and it's changing to white, it's starting to discolor or yellow, and you're seeing little cracks appear on the surface of a plastic. And those are just causing the release of microplastics and the degradation of a plastic itself. So all plastic comes from human activity. There is no natural plastic in this world. Again, then that means that there are no natural microplastics in this world. So they're coming from things like our tires that are synthetic rubber. They're coming from our laundry machines that are washing out microfibers from our clothing, to when we are, painting boats or just releasing trash into our ocean unintentionally. So where do we find them? Well, we can find them in almost every part of our environment. Whether that is our indoor or our outdoor air environments, we will find microplastics. One of the, I think, wider understood and exciting papers that came out this summer found that there were about 1,000 tons of microplastics deposited to national parks, areas that are protected, every year. And that equates to about, I think they said over 100 million water bottles in the same comparison of microplastics being deposited to our national parks. Now, these things are carried by, local cities to even global air currents, depending on their size and the type of plastic. To, if you go into your indoor air environment, there's almost 10 times more microplastics that you will come into contact with in the indoor air than the outdoor air environment, because we are wearing clothes that are synthetic, like our polyester or our rayon nylon, to we're sitting in furniture, or we have carpets that are also all made of plastic. So we have a pretty large exposure to microplastics from just our own indoor air environment. When we go to water, we know that we can find microplastics in our bottled and in our tap water. Some of those differences are still trying to be worked out and better estimated, but we know that that is going to be a problem of some kind. And most of them are removed in the drinking water process for tap water, especially in comparison to bottled water. If you go to our marine environment, you can see that there's predictions of over 3 trillion microplastic pieces on the surface of an ocean. And then switching into our soils. So if we are removing microplastics and microfibers that are coming from our laundry and our waste, and we are putting them in with the waste sludge or the sewage sludge that has been removed, we usually land apply that to agricultural sites. And so if we are taking all of those microplastics, millions and millions of them, and putting them in the agricultural sites, then we are contributing so many microplastics to our soil environments, causing questions of what's happening to our biogeochemical cycles of nutrients, what's happening to the terrestrial life that feeds off of these soils. But yeah, there's just a lot of microplastics coming from a variety of sources. So next, plastic can contain chemicals. And I think you can see a kind of a nice picture of one of them where there's a extraction of a plastic and it's turned the liquid white. Very interesting things that can come out of plastics. So we know that plastic can contain up to thousands of known and unknown chemicals and hazards. Some of the reasons that, at least as scientists, we don't know is because these are considered consumer business information or just trade secrets, so that we as the public don't have the right to know what's in the products that we are, consuming out of and working with. So that's always been one of the big issues of trying to understand what chemicals are there, along with the fact that when you are making plastic, you are also introducing sometimes non-intentionally added substances. And so those are just things that are accidentally added, or they are compounds that have reacted with each other to form different kinds of chemicals. And so there are a variety of plastic chemicals like Monomers, those are the things that make a plastic, flame retardants, plasticizers, and even things that can help the aesthetics like dyes and colorants, to biocides. So you don't want your shampoo bottle to start growing a bunch of biofilm on it. So you add things like biocides to prevent a bunch of like fungus that starts to grow on the surface of a plastic. But that's not really great if you throw that same plastic bottle into the environment, if you're going to release those same biocides into our freshwater or marine life. Go ahead.
So we have a few questions. We have one from Molly that says, are all plastics non-biodegradable? Do they vary? And then how does the breakdown kind of vary between them?
Biodegradable is a very interesting question. I think another great video I just posted is on biodegradable plastics. So if I don't fully get to it, you can definitely watch that one for more content. But biodegradable is difficult to characterize. Not all plastics are non-biodegradable, but the way that we define biodegradable is plastic that can be degraded by enzymes or by microbial life of some kind. And so that means that it has to fully degrade from that plastic into carbon dioxide, water, and biomass in a short amount of time. And a lot of the plastics that have been advertised as biodegradable actually are not doing that in the environment. They have shown that things like PLA, the polylactic acid that's listed as biodegradable, will not degrade in seawater because they don't have the right conditions for the right kinds of microorganisms, for the enzymes that they're looking for, and it's too cold. So a lot of those kinds of plastics actually require that plastic has to get put into an industrial facility that has the right kind of temperature, has the right kind of mixture of organisms that can actually start the degradation process to condense it. So biodegradable is kind of like a landmine of really trying to understand what that means and what that is. So it can be pretty misleading. And then you had another question on it as well.
Yeah, we have one that asks, is there anything we can do to slow the production of microplastics or other solutions for collecting it before it's, dispersed and let go into the environment?
There is no known technology to remove microplastics really from these environments. I'm sure that we're probably going to figure out some way to try and get to the bottom of that. But the easiest or most logical solution is to try and stop waste from getting into our environment. So stopping, the ever rising amount of plastic that we are using and then throwing away so carelessly, like our bottled water, if that is something that you can do, limiting the amount of single-use plastic that you use on a daily basis. So it's a difficult one. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and then there's Katie brings up that isn't there some kind of fungus, or do you know of maybe the research revolving around this fungus that is known to be able to break down plastics?
I think there was an article about some kind of enzyme that can eat styrofoam. So it really depends on the plastic type, what compounds can be consumed, and so yeah, they are definitely in the works to try and figure out certain kinds of organisms that can break down these plastics, but it really depends on if it's in the right kind of conditions in the environment, if they're, that may be the most viable thing if they're in like landfill situations or compost facilities, but I think unleashing, a swath of fungus into our ocean may not be the best solution to try and get rid of things that are already in the wrong environment. So invasive species can be an issue. But, I think the other thing is for those studies is they don't look at the chemicals. They don't say, okay, the styrofoam's gone. Well, what about all of these plastic additives that were placed in that? Was that also disappearing, or did that end up being concentrated in the organism? And is that organism going to get consumed by another one and move up the food chain so that we're concentrating really these chemicals that can be carcinogenic, mutagens, toxic to aquatic life, or just stay in our environment forever, like those forever chemicals like PFAS. Some of the great examples of chemicals include BPA. That's a compound that a lot of people know about because they see, oh, it's BPA free, baby products or BPA free water bottles. Okay, that's great. But What about other compounds like bisphenol F that replaced BPA that are basically the same structure almost? And some of those other bisphenols can be just as toxic as the BPA or more because they are known endocrine disruptors. So we're not really looking at chemicals as a class when we're thinking about toxicity. We're only thinking about individual chemicals. And if we get enough public outrage over one chemical, we'll swap it for another. And so I think that's kind of one of the flaws that we have in our system, is not looking at chemical classes to really say what is safe or not. Another great example are these phthalates. These are plasticizers. The dibutyl phthalate at the bottom, that compound is listed under Prop 65 in California as this warning sign. If you enter a hotel that has products like most plastics have phthalates, that they'll say that these are chemicals here that the state of California acknowledges can cause cancer, birth defects, or any kind of reproductive harm. So we really need to kind of evaluate things that are placed in plastic and where they go and how they can cause harm to our environment or ourselves. When we think about microplastics in our marine life or terrestrial organisms, we can think of physical effects where they get stuck in our guts, where there are lowered energy levels associated to eating these microplastics, to the chemical effects where they have lowered fertility. There's examples of slugworms that eat microplastics and they produce less eggs. If we have less of those, we're going to have species depletion, other kinds of issues with microplastics. To cell death or cancer. And so these all have wide implications for our food web, for population structures and sizes. And so really, really big questions for understanding microplastics. When we think about concerns for human health, so the bottom line to it is we don't know what microplastics do to humans. We know that we consume a lot of microplastics. I think it's almost like 20 to 50,000 particles a year of some kind of microplastics, but we have no proof that that is bad or good. But we are looking at models like rat models to try and understand a little bit better. One of the areas where we're concerned about is through dust inhalation. Depending on the size of the microplastic, we can think about the possibility for these particles to enter human tissues and move through the body. And so that's the question of, is it blood cell toxic? Can it produce inflammation in our lungs? And so if we go from micro to nanoplastics in particular, those are the ones that we are a little bit more worried about and what could possibly happen for the future. However, there are models that are showing that there's a possibility for chemicals that were in those plastics to be released into those stomach contents within the stomach or the intestine. So we don't know. That's kind of the bottom line, but we are concerned. We need a lot more research in this area to really come up with a definitive answer. But in general, microplastics are a problem. They're almost in every environment, and they can cause different kinds of harm to at least marine and terrestrial organisms. So we do need stronger policies for microplastic monitoring, for reducing single-use plastic. And there's an act that was introduced to Congress in February called the Break Free from Pollution Act. And so that is one way that we can kind of make our voice known by saying, hey, we want this act to kind of push forward and work to eliminate our plastic problems. I think we just had a question on like, what can we do now? So I think one of the ways that we can try and make a difference is through reducing our use of plastic, especially single-use plastic. If you go get takeout, say, hey, I don't need the utensil, I'm gonna eat it at home. If you can use a reusable water bottle, that's a great way to try and reduce plastic consumption. To bringing your own bags for when you go grocery shopping. Even in the midst of this pandemic, switching from disposable masks to ones that you can wash over and over again. And so one of the greatest inputs of microfibers into our water is from our clothing, is from when we wash our clothing. And so thinking about line drying to prevent the release of those microplastics as much as possible, or adding a filter to the back of your washer machine to try and take them out before they end up in our waterways, to reducing the kinds of things that we're buying as often as we are. And so, yeah, just really thinking about some of our inputs of plastic, and kind of urging, technology and companies to really engineer better plastics. So like the biodegradable plastic. Question?
That leads us to a couple of our really good questions. So one point brought up is that sometimes, devil's advocate, corporations will care about public health. Do we know of any companies that are supporting the research on plastics, or is there any, company that maybe we could support more or less?
Yeah, so there is a huge coalition of plastic, or like companies that are trying to work towards that, and trying to build what's called a circular economy, where they don't lose the plastic to the landfills. They can take it back and recycle it into the system for a whole new product. I think most companies are trying to get along that line and try and think about how to do it. The promise of recycling is kind of difficult right now, because as much as they believe in what's called advanced chemical recycling, it hasn't fully been developed, and it's not fully implemented in the country. And a lot of the plastic that we say is going to get recycled sometimes accidentally just ends up in the landfill, or is not recycled, because a lot of the plastic that America is producing and wasting used to go to countries like China, and they would do the recycling themselves. And so with the import ban that China put in, we can no longer basically take our plastic over there to actually get recycled. So they predict that of the 9% of all plastic that we actually recycle, it's going to go down to like 2.9% because of that import ban, because we don't have the facilities here to do that kind of recycling, because it's we just don't have the infrastructure, and sometimes there's not a market for it, for us to be able to pay people to do that and do that kind of technology. But that's really what a lot of the companies are trying to rely on, is recycling instead of reducing or changing their plastic for the better. So it's hard for me to throw a name out yet. But yeah, there are definitely companies that are looking at different angles to this and working on it.
So that circular sort of economy of the recycling within your own company, that's, one research way, I guess, of a solution to the problem. Are there any others? Like, is there a way to maybe make these plastic compounds less stable or something, to, like break them down faster, or, what else is going on in the field?
Yeah, so I guess the first example of like just circular economy again is the bottle take back programs, like in certain states where like Coca-Cola will take back their bottles and recycle them back into the system. For how do we handle plastic? Well, we can either throw it in a landfill and let it stay there for hundreds of years to eventually degrade into microplastics and then into its final form. It can end up in our incinerators, which is not a lot of plastic. I mean, I think globally that's probably about 11% or so of all plastic is incinerated. But that just means that we are kind of heating it up really quick and fast, and then those fumes sometimes get cleaned up as much as possible. Sometimes they're not fully cleaned, and that can release harmful gases, compounds like dioxins into our air, and so that's not really good for air quality if we're doing an incinerator route. And then it doesn't actually reintroduce the plastic back into the system. And so the solutions that people are also thinking about within recycling is converting that plastic into fuel again, because most plastic comes from crude oil, from petroleum, and that process will actually make plastic. And so they're trying to retake that plastic back and make more fuel from the original products, or they'll use it as starters to make new plastic, so that they can add more recycled content back into the original plastic. And so that's kind of the route of advanced chemical recycling. Mechanical recycling is when you grind down the plastic, wash it, and then try and kind of melt it back into a new form. And so that can that can be good, but it's not, you can't use the same kind of plastic over and over again for that purpose, because you're kind of ruining the integrity of the plastic after so many times of kind of melting and reforming that same plastic structure. So that one doesn't have as much of a lifespan to it as chemical recycling, but that's primarily what we've been doing for recycling, is mechanical based recycling. There are companies that are trying to make plastic from different sources than petroleum or crude oil. And so that's where the bioplastics kind of come in, or biodegradable plastic, because those are two different things sometimes, which is also very confusing for people if they see, oh, it's got a green leaf and it says it's a bioplastic. That's safe, right? Well, no, not always, because sometimes they'll make what's called biopolyethylene. And it is essentially the same as the original polyethylene that you see. It's just made from a different source than oil or gas. And so that will still take just as long to degrade in our environment. It'll still make microplastics, and it'll still have chemicals placed inside of it to aid in the structure of that compound. So switching to things just for the sake of it comes from a different source may not be the best idea if we're not fully thinking through, okay, well, how long is it going to stay in our environment? What other things are you adding into it? Is this a food contact material? So really thinking about the technology and things that we can do with it.
And then we have sort of related. Do you know of any labs that are conducting research into plastic degradation or using something like a bioengineered organism?
Can you repeat the first part again?
Just do you know of any labs conducting research into plastic degradation?
I know that there is a lab in North Carolina, Wilmington. Oh my gosh, I have to come up with her name again. But a professor there is looking at melting plastic and understanding how that can like be reused for other purposes. So I know there's quite a few labs looking at waste. I know Jenna Jamback looks at plastic waste and where it goes and what happens there. That's at the University of Georgia. But I'm not as much tuned into like that kind of research route of like how plastic is degraded, because most of what I do is look at the chemistry of the plastic and like what chemicals are present in the plastic. So there's definitely labs out there that are working on it. And then for companies that are looking at different kinds of sources for plastic or organisms, I know that there is a company that uses fungus to make a new kind of like plastic or fashion of clothing. And I have to remember exactly where that came from, but I saw an article on it where they're using, they're growing fungus, and that fungus is supposed to make spools of thread that make a whole new kind of sustainable fashion line that's supposed to be able to biodegrade quickly and be a better source or idea. But I don't know if there's any scientists that looked into their company and looked into their actual clothing brands to also like pre-approve that as well as a message. But yeah, I've definitely heard of at least that one, where that they're doing that for like the fashion industry. For plastic degradability, I mean, we can even share articles if we wanted of just people doing different studies on different kinds of plastic. But yeah.
Yeah, it's a whole lot. And it's relatively new, right? Like this is sort of, this whole field of microplastics is just beginning to come into light, or come into public view anyway. And so this question I really like. This actually came from my sister. Hi, Charlotte. She said, are some types of microplastics more common in some places than others? So do they get distributed into water, air, different geographic locations, etc.?
I think the paper that was showing the deposition of microplastics in national parks was really interesting, because they were showing the difference between what happens with rain events versus during the year when it's like the dry season. And so they are showing that microplastics coming from rain were coming from the cities close by to the national park. And those that were deposited through the air and through dust were typically lighter in smaller particles, and they were traveling on global wind currents. So yeah, size matters, and plastic type can matter. I think in the the study, they were also saying that a lot of the micro beads, the primary microplastics that they were finding, were like pink in color. So they were able to categorize the kinds of colors that they were seeing. And then I think fibers were a large majority of what they were finding. So the other thing is tires. A lot of the plastic pieces that we'll find in the outdoor environment are coming from our tire rubble. And so that's one that a lot of scientists are seeing and noticing, but we don't know what to do about that other than, you know, let's all carpool and take public transportation as much as possible. But, you know, we all drive, we all have places to get, maybe less so since a lot of us are working from home, but that's a hard one to kind of work with and trying to find an alternative for tires. So if anyone has one, that'd be great.
And then this is a great time to kind of talk about like what you were saying, more of your involvement with the research, which is almost categorizing these compounds, correct?
Yeah, so most of what I do is look at what are called endocrine disrupting chemicals like bisphenol A and their release into water. So, and then the other things that I do are I will take a plastic, I will put it in water, and I will take I'll take samples of that water over 5 days or over 3 months. And I'll say, hey, what compounds am I seeing over those, you know, over that week or those few weeks? And how are they changing over time? And then what happens if I take that plastic and I expose it to UV light for 2 weeks before I put it in the water? What happens if the polymer bonds have been kind of challenged by that light? And does that change the composition of different kinds of chemicals that are released? Does that mean that there'll be more or less chemicals and then how do I identify them? Because like I said before, a lot of them can be known and a lot of them are unknown. And so that's really the biggest challenge that I have, is that I do what's called non-target analysis. And so that's mass spectrometry, where you are kind of a forensic scientist and you get these basically exact mass of a substance, and you have, you know, down to 6 decimal points of a compound, and you say, okay, well, what kind of, how many carbons, how many hydrogens do I need to make that exact mass? How many, you know, nitrogens? And then say, okay, let's go relate that to what we find in the literature. How do we match these spectra to other known spectra to say, okay, this is probably the structure of the compound. Okay, well, what is the structure? Is it even a polymer additive, or is it not? Maybe it's a non-intentional added substance. And then do we have data on if it's toxic or not? Because it's easy to find a bunch of compounds, but does it matter if they're not harmful to our environment? The real question is, what are the compounds that we're really trying to understand and that are being released over time that can cause harm to our environment or to ourselves? So it's a really big puzzle to try and put together, but it's one of the things that I really enjoy about this work.
I'm laughing a little bit to myself because untargeted metabolomics, what you're describing, is quite possibly, in my opinion, one of the hardest puzzles in the entire universe. And it's one of the reasons I kind of did not stay on the toxicology path I was originally on. I mean, it's a lot of work. So just for the people that are less familiar with the analytical side, will you just run through quickly sort of how a mass spec works? And just the basics, you know, and then sort of like reconstructing these chemicals and how they look. And then a little bit, I'd like to hear how the look or the you know, characteristics of the compounds, how do you kind of parse through those and sort out which ones are, you know, the most toxic, the least toxic?
Yeah. Let's just even go back to a slide where there's chemicals so you can see it. Okay, so
the can of worms I just opened.
there's 2 different kinds of mass spectrometry that I'm doing. One is targeted, where I know exactly the compound that I want, like bisphenol A, and I say, okay, this is the exact compound I'm going to monitor for because I have this compound in my lab. I know exactly what it is and where it's going to show up in our machine and like how it breaks apart. And so I can use that information to predict the concentration and in the presence in my samples. For non-target analysis, I'm taking a sample and I'm putting it through first what's called liquid chromatography, and that will basically spread apart the compounds based on how polar they are. And so this will be basically a 45-minute run, and certain compounds are going to be, more polar and then less polar. And so that'll allow us to see different times that the peaks will show up for individual compounds. And so as those compounds are entering the system, they're undergoing what's called electrospray ionization. And so they are adding a charge to the compound, and that'll give it a mass to charge ratio. So that compound will show up in the instrument, and then it'll start to get hit with energy, and that will break the compound down into smaller fragments. And so that's what's giving you like a second spectra. Your first spectra is what is the full compound plus the charge that it has been given, and then the second spectra that you get is what is the compound once it's been hit with energy, and what are those different fragments that it's broken apart into. So you take that information of both the unfragmented and the fragmented compound, along with what time did it show up in the instrument, and you use that information to try and put together what is the exact mass of the compound, to what is the exact molecular formula of that compound, and then has anybody else ever run that same compound where they actually had it in-house and they put it on an instrument as well, that you can match their spectra to your spectra. And so that's library matching. So that would make things a lot easier if there were a ton of libraries that people already had for these compounds. So that's where things can get a little bit more interesting if we don't have that. And that means that there has to be some machine learning techniques used as well to try and predict, if you fragment compounds that you've never seen before, how well can we predict what that compound might be? And so it can get very, very complicated and difficult once you get into that path of, okay, I at least know the molecular formula and I know what time it comes out. And you got to kind of look into using your own chemical intuition when you're dealing with these kinds of samples, because I know that this is a compound that comes, primarily from plastic. I'm also looking at what we have of databases of compounds. So I'm looking for things that have the same molecular formula, and I'm trying to say, hey, can we fragment those and see if they match up with the ones that we find? So I rely pretty heavily on what we know and what we don't know, but there are definitely tons of compounds. Like, I can get a list of hundreds of things that are being released, and I can only identify like 20 or 50. So it's a huge puzzle.
Right. It's like a giant game of guess who. So you just kind of like, you're like, do you have, red hair? No. Okay.
Right.
So,
I'm really good at saying it's not this.
Right. Which is one step closer. And so when you do categorize these, like I mentioned before, some, may be less toxic or more toxic. And I know that's probably a very difficult thing to say because, they all act differently depending on where they are and what they're doing. But is there sort of a way to select safer plastics and to start engineering plastics using, I guess, the most safe plasticizers?
I think what we're getting in the weeds for is green engineering or green chemistry. And so designing chemicals to kind of have the same functionality, but be safe in mind. And that's a field that I'm also very interested in, but I'm not as well versed in. Because usually people will focus more on making a chemical for its function and not really worrying about the safety as much. But it is something that scientists are working on, and there is a field for it, and people are trying to do it, but it's really hard to keep up. So a lot of companies have the responsibility placed on themselves to do their toxicology work in-house. But when we have millions of compounds that are being patented and used, it's very hard for them to also do the kind of toxicology that I think would justify like safety sometimes for compounds. So there's definitely ways to do it. I just don't really have that information as much for like, this is the exact chemical we should replace with a bisphenol A, because that's just kind of not really the part of the field that I'm working in. But chemical engineers, they probably know. maybe a little bit better than me.
I was gonna say, they're gonna be my next victim on the show, so don't worry, we'll get there.
Perfect.
And then can you speak a little bit about what are the biggest threats associated with microplastic pollution?
A lot of them, I think, have not been well characterized. I think the questions that I have mostly for microplastics are, what are the impacts to marine life, to terrestrial organisms? How are they going to affect things like phytoplankton that make up the majority of our oxygen on the earth, and help with carbon cycling for climate change purposes? So I know that they've said that like covering the surface of the ocean with microplastics can kind of inhibit the ability for phytoplankton to like oh gosh, I can't say words anymore. Like the photosynthetic rate has been reduced sometimes by covering of microplastics. So looking at how we are changing species dynamics is a question I have, how we are causing danger to smaller organisms. If the question of, is it possible for microplastics to carry up the food chain? I mean, we know that we can find microplastics in seafood, but did it come from that original fish, or did it come from what the fish ate? Those are things that I have questions on. Two, if we're throwing microplastics in the soil, is it possible for those microplastics to get uptaken into the roots and end up in our fruits and vegetables? Now, there are studies that are looking at that, and they have claimed that they see nanoplastics in like fruit, like in carrots, in apples, but I'm not as sold on those studies just yet, because they did not confirm them with analytical techniques. So those things that kind of look like microplastics, I'm not so sure if they actually are. But I think the research is expanding, and we're going to get a little bit closer to understanding some of those impacts and things that have brought concern to me, to even thinking about what are the impacts of like inhaling fibers, and how long does it take for us to reach that point of, I think they say that the effect for humans would not really be felt until we are consuming like 350 grams of microplastics or plastics, which is really unrealistic at this point, unless you are like some of the people in My Strange Addiction, like eating mattresses or like toothpicks or something, like plastic toothpicks. I don't think that that's as much of a reality right now. But if we, keep going on this path of like, making so much plastic that is only used once and then thrown away and tossed away and put into our environment, like, we're not looking on a good path right now. So the other question is, how much is present in our tap water? There have only been a few studies really done to look at tap water and bottled water, so it's not really a robust amount of information. But I know in places like California, they're starting to work on actually putting in monitoring plans for water, public water. To I know New York started having their public conference on microplastics to see if they can try and put something together. So the things that I worry about are really just, we don't have a lot of the pieces to the puzzle, and we need to do a little bit more research to determine if things are safe or if there are better alternatives.
Yeah, and so this is kind of like almost an existential problem, it's large. Yeah. So where will you start when you start to answer these questions? What is going to be kind of your plan of attack? And obviously it's not just you, it's your team.
Right.
And, yeah, but in general.
I think for at least for me, it's still the chemistry route. Like I'm saying, like, hey, we need to think about what are safe chemicals, in our products and in our environment for human health. How do we really identify them and get on the same page? I think for the plastic community or microplastic community in general, it's looking at life cycle analysis of plastic and saying, is this really a good alternative to using things like glass or bamboo? And not just thinking about it from the fact of, oh, plastic can degrade into microplastics and can, harm certain organisms, but how does that affect climate change? If we switch from all plastic to plastic bags to cotton bags, which can take more water, can take more energy, thinking truly about how energy is used to make a product and, process the product, to how far do you have to travel with it, how heavy is it? So really just being a little bit more comprehensive about what does it mean when we use different alternatives that are either reusable or also single use, because I think they show that plastic water bottles can have a lower impact overall than a glass a glass like Coca-Cola bottle. And that's just because glass is heavier, and when you transport it farther, it can have an issue with that kind of usage. So really paying attention to the minute differences between what kinds of plastic are important to tackle and replace or engineer better.
And then, I have one that says, I'd love to hear more about the effects of microplastics and carbon cycling. Do microplastics affect tree leaves the same way that maybe, the phytoplankton do with the water, or the water does with phytoplankton, like making the film kind of on the leaves and inhibiting the photosynthesis? And that's kind of,
Whoa.
Charlotte, that's kind of an intense question. I don't know if we know that.
That's hard. Plastic has a weird relationship with climate change. We know that plastic will also release, like CO2 will release gases into our environment, but sometimes it is a better product than others based on like the amount that's used for energy and input. So in the ocean, I think there's still only a few studies really looking at that on phytoplankton. And I think they were just saying that it was just the coverage of sunlight that was like blocking the ability for those phytoplankton to do photosynthesis. But yeah, we need more work in that area to really understand the carbon cycle associated to plastic, and how that can, either aid or inhibit the ability for that carbon to go further into our ocean and complete that cycle. But we know it's also related to ocean acidification in some ways. And there's tons of avenues for research in this area.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I hope that this video makes it around to some high school or sort of undergraduate age students. What sort of advice would you give to them, or what sort of, where are the holes in this research in your eyes?
One of the biggest holes that I'm starting to notice is kind of a little bit more intersectional than just the science, but also like a social science aspect to it. Looking at environmental justice of plastic pollution and microplastic exposure. We know a lot about what's happening in, our freshwater and our oceans, but not a lot about what's happening in our indoor home, and how much of the dust is microplastics, and how many people have more older carpets or something that are inhaling that kind of plastic. To there are communities of color that are usually localized near facilities that make plastic, and are they breathing in gaseous air, or the incinerators that they tend to live near because there's just not a lot of choices, or that land is a little bit cheaper associated to it, or the facility decided to place themselves in communities of color. If you don't have a choice to consume, but to kind of consume things that are cheaper, which are typically packaged. There is a study that showed that like even opening bags can release microplastics into like your food. Like if you're opening a chip bag and you're releasing microplastics, it's kind of scary. So thinking about if you live in a food desert and there are no other options but to go to the gas station for food that you consume, or a Dollar Tree, you're being exposed to so much more plastic than a typical consumer that goes to a farmer's market more often. So thinking about the social science aspects of plastic exposure, not just because like we're not trying to say like everyone needs to stop using plastic right now, because a lot of people don't have that choice. It's a privilege to be able to kind of substitute for a mason jar sometimes. Or thinking about drinking water. Some people don't have safe drinking water, or they don't trust their drinking water because they have seen with history that sometimes it isn't as clean as they say that it is, like Flint, Michigan. So there's just a lot more social science aspects, including the science, that need to be intertwined when we do this kind of research for the human health perspective. And so I think the social science perspective is important. Looking at health effects is a huge hole. We really just don't know. to, yeah, carbon cycling, climate change, even the chemicals. I only know a few people that actually look at the chemicals that are in the plastic, because a lot of people were looking at the chemicals that would show up and attach to the plastic, like a sponge in the ocean, because they thought, oh, we are having all these toxic chemicals in the ocean and this plastic's acting like a magnet for them. So what happens if the fish consumes it? Will those toxic chemicals just re-release back into the fish? And those were things that were done when I was starting to do this research. And they were kind of pointing in the direction of, no, it's a little bit more likely for that chemical to stay on the plastic than end up in the fish. But nobody was really looking into what about the chemicals that were already in the plastic and how they can end up being released into water and organisms. So those are a few ideas. But for young students, I would just say, really think about things that make you passionate, because that's what's going to keep you going in the right direction. Think about, even if you don't like a certain aspect of science, like if you're not crazy about math, you got to think about the ultimate goal in mind. And it's okay to not be crazy about math, to still be an engineer or a scientist. And yeah, just stay tuned in to what's already happening around you and what you see. So I'm here.
And Imari, what do you think your next steps or your next goal is going to be, following your label as doctor?
Right. So that's a big question that I'm still thinking about. I am thinking about continuing to do a little bit of research, at least for the next year or two after, hopefully in biodegradable plastics, we'll see, or other compounds that are also really of concern in our water and in our environment. So still along the chemistry route, still very applicable to my passions for water quality. So I think that's definitely something. I'm not going to discount looking into politics, or being a part of our government to help change some of those laws and how we study chemicals and study plastic. I'm still going to be on YouTube, so I'm still going to be talking about plastic. I'm still going to be talking about chemicals that we find in our homes. I'm still going to talk about what it means to be an environmental engineer. So if you want to follow me there and see my journey, like that is totally free, and I'd be happy to share that with you all.
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up, because yeah, her YouTube channel is like just repository of information. It's like a library of microplastic information. That's completely free. It's crazy. So jump on that while you have the chance. And Imari, thank you so much. I wish you the very best this summer, and your journey through your PhD coming to an end. This is very, very exciting. And this was all fantastic information. Very scary, but good to know.
I mean, we don't know enough, but it's good to get energized and work towards the right direction. So thank you all for having me. Thank you for your wonderful questions, because now they have me thinking too. So yeah, I hope you all have a great Friday.
All right. We'll see you folks next time on Ask a Scientist. Bye.